Hello, and welcome to IGI's webcast, Creating an Iterative Dashboard, Making Sense of Burndowns, Burn-Ups, and Other Practical Project Measures. In today's webcast, Ian Spence will provide strategies and guidance in building and using an iterative dashboard in your organization. I'm today's moderator, and I have a few general housekeeping notes to mention before we begin today's session. Everybody on the call will be on mute for noise volume, and as well, if you have questions, we are very interested in receiving questions. You can submit them via the control panel in GoToMeeting, and you can submit them at any time during the webcast, and at the end of the webcast, Ian will attempt to answer all questions received as long as we have time, and we usually do, so please feel free to submit your question at any time during the webcast. I'd like to introduce Ian Spence to everyone. Ian specializes in the Agile application of the unified process. He is a certified RUP practitioner, Scrum Master, and an experienced coach, having worked with hundreds of projects to introduce iterative and agile techniques. He has over 20 years' experience in the software industry, covering the complete development lifecycle, including requirements capture, architecture, analysis, design, implementation, and project management. His specialty subjects are iterative project management, agile team working, and requirements management with use cases. Ian is co-author of the Addison Wesley books, Use Case Modeling and Managing Iterative Software Development Projects. And a short introduction to IGI for those not familiar with the organization. IGI is a global services company helping software organizations transform and improve the way in which they develop software solutions, as well as guide them in meeting the expectations of their business. The ultimate goal for every development organization is to produce good software quickly and at low cost. At IGI, our focus and expertise is to resolve issues in the areas of bridging the gap between business and IT, defining requirements and ensuring solutions meet the needs of the business, meeting project budgets and deadlines, and getting teams to work effectively. The company was founded in 2004 by Ivar Jacobson because he realized the need for organizations to work in a smarter way. IGI works with clients around the globe and in a variety of industries. I'll now pass the presentation over to Ian. And 2 seconds, Ian, I'll give you... There we go. Over to you, Ian. Thank you.
Oh, thanks for the introduction, Leanne. So, as I'm sure many of you are aware, this is the third in a series of webinars on measurement. The two previous webinars, of which recordings are available on the IGI website, looked at ways of sets of measurements and a measurement framework for agile organizations, focused very much on being able to set improvement targets and measure whether or not your new way of working was better than your old way, in a fashion that would allow you to continue to evolve your way of working. This webinar we'd want to look at measuring projects, which is, as we'll see, a different kind of thing. The idea of having a project dashboard, something which you can look at to understand the state of the project, is very popular. But really, when we have a dashboard, the point of the dashboard is to allow us to steer. If you think of a dashboard in a car or on a manufacturing plant, it's as much to help us keep and steer and make sure that things are going in the right direction. So we'll start with just a little examination of why we'd want to build a dashboard for iterative projects. As part of that, we'll see that there's two perspectives we want to have on our project. One is the performance across iterations, so we can steer the project to the right conclusion, but also what can we do inside iterations to make sure that those iterations themselves achieve the goals that we've set for them. And we'll finish off with a little summary of what measures you should put in place and then how to get started. So the good thing about iterative projects and the concept of iterations or sprints and things, as we see in Scrum, is that they have the built-in concept of a feedback loop. An iteration is a time box with clear objectives, and at the end of the time box we will have an assessment, a retrospective, do a demonstration. But what we're going to do is assess the quality of the work that's been done, assess the progress that has been made. And as we see in a lot of literature about things like this, we want to look at this objectively and empirically and measure the outputs so that we can make course corrections, change working practices, improve things. Iterations provide us with this controlling feedback loop, but to make use of that feedback we need to have measures that tell us where we are, how we're doing, and indicate the things that we need to improve and change. If we don't use the iterations, the time boxes, to provide feedback so that we can adjust the course of the project, then they're not really iterations, they're just, we've just split the project up into months or something like that. So feedback is integral to all agile, all iterative approaches, including things like Scrum with sprints and the unified process and all those things. So when we're looking at measuring our iterations, how should we go about measuring these things? And the most interesting thing to help us with steering a project is to look at the trends. It's all about how does this iteration compare with the previous iteration, compare with the one before that, and based on those observations, what do we predict for the future iterations? So if we can gather information each iteration on progress, for example, we can extrapolate based on our understanding of what's going on and work out whether we're going to meet our targets or not. So trends and targets are very important for the things that we're going to measure. We may be able to turn our interpretation of some of those trends into warning indicators or speedometers on our dashboard, but really it's the trend and where it's taking us in relation to the target that is the thing we really want to see. And to do that we need objective and empirical data. We want to know when things are done or not. We don't want to know when something's half done. So a lot of the sort of earned value metrics that you see are based on assumptions that documentation is worth 50% of the value of the project. With iterative projects we focus very much on the real results, primarily what we can ascertain from the amount of working tested software that's been produced. To be effective with our measurement, we want to measure across the iterations because this allows us to see the progress in context. To be able to make sense of the measurements, we've got to know what the target is. A measure without a target may be interesting, but it won't help us to steer the project. We need to know what our tolerances are, where we're trying to get to. We also might want to measure inside the iterations to guide the team, and these are the things that we would be looking about today. So with our iterative iterations in place, we need to identify some measures, and if we can make those measures visible, we can actually create a dashboard that will help us to steer the project. And just like steering a car or flying a plane, what we want is a dashboard that's actually going to help the team. We're not looking at a dashboard to judge things. Remember, this is in flight. The real results and value developed by the project will come through the releases and those larger gateways. So we will have measures at that bigger picture, but here we're looking for things to actually help us steer our project, and this is a dashboard for the project members. So when we look at measurement, the first thing we should always look at before we introduce any measures is what's the goal. I'm a big fan of the goal question metric idea. Unfortunately, what tends to happen is people work out what they can measure and then they try and reverse engineer to some purpose for it. So we see lots of technical, lots of secondary measures. If you did listen to either of the previous two webinars in this series, you'll have seen this better, faster, cheaper, happier framework before. We need to remember why we've introduced iterations, why we want to be agile. It's because this offers us the ability to be better, to have better quality, better predictability about what we're doing. It's because we need to be faster, shorter time to market, faster response times to our customers. We would like to produce, have more bang for the buck, produce the software in a way that's more cost effective and provides more value. and we would like to have happy customers and happy team members. So this is just a way to think about what we're doing in a framework. When we iterate, what we expect to see is progress in these areas every iteration. Each iteration we should be better than we were the previous one. Each iteration, we want to be get ourselves producing the right stuff in an effective manner. We can get continuous improvement through the iterative process. And the other thing we need to bear in mind is that what works for organizations, the measures that we look at when we look at the big picture, are going to be different from those that apply to projects. We can use the same frameworks. We use the better, faster, cheaper, happier in both contexts, but you'll see a very different set of measures for the organization than you see for the project. One of the key characteristics of a good organizational measure is that it is method process independent. When we're looking at a dashboard for iterative projects, it's going to be tightly coupled to the whole idea of iteration. That makes one of the big differences. So if you look at the different levels we're going to be reporting measures at, so for an organization or department, we can have an organizational dashboard, typically produced monthly for the department, and for each program or working group within the department. And that's what we looked at in the other two webinars in the series. Projects are measured differently. Projects will be reporting at the frequency of their iterations. Some projects may be iterating 2 weeks, some may be taking longer. And also we'll be focusing on other things, very important trends within the project. So we'll be looking at things like the actual absolute progress made by the projects every iteration. Whereas at an organizational level, we're interested in stuff that's been released. We're not so interested in intermediate points because those aren't available for us to get value from yet. Think about things like risk exposure, which is one of the key measures we'll be looking at. A program's risk exposure is not the sum of the project's risk exposure, and the department's risk exposure is not the sum of the programs. In fact, some of the biggest risks at a program level are those that fall in between the projects, or those caused by friction and dependencies between projects, which don't always appear in those project risk lists. So we're looking at a dashboard to help us steer our iterative projects, and we need to bear in mind when we're doing this who the stakeholders are. They want different things, and they want different things from the different levels. So the kind of measures that we want at the project team, and if we're looking at a project, we could be looking at from outside or inside, but we want to know how far they've gone, how far they have left to go when they're done, about the quality of what's being produced so we can improve quality in flight, and information to tell them when they're off track and when to make course corrections. That information is useful to different stakeholders, but it's really here so we can get to grips and steer the project. It's different from organizational measures, which are looking at how the organization is doing as a whole, which are the best practices, which areas are doing the best, what kind of work have we got coming up, are we set up for what's going on, and for comparing performance with other organizations or with our previous year in terms of productivity, etc. So what kinds of things could we have on one of these dashboards? So here we've got a slide. Don't worry if this looks a little bit scary, because that's its intention. We're not short of things that we can measure, either organizationally or within a project. With iterative projects, there are quite a lot of candidate measures, and this is why the goals become important. Also, the maturity of the organization. An organization using the dashboard as we show here is one that's fully committed and is used to iterating, and that they're naturally gathering lots of information that we can look at and view and know how to steer our projects. In the better area, we have things like risk exposure and escape defects for quality. We can even have some dials and indicators to show whether we have too many priority 1 or priority 2 defects, etc. We'll look at some of these a bit more later. In the area of faster, we've got the progress we're making, and the velocity, a very common measure for agile and iterative projects. we can also look at things like the velocity check. Is the velocity sufficient to allow us to meet our goals? So that's the kind of interpretation we can add as part of our dashboard. In the bottom left, which would be the cheaper quartile, we mainly look at effort and cost and the ways that those trend over time. And in the bottom right hand corner where we see the happier stuff, we want to understand if our stakeholders are happy with the way the project's going, if our team is happy with their way of working, the way that they're going, and whether we've got things like sufficient stakeholder involvement. And we'll talk a bit more about those later. In the middle here we have our Burndown chart, which is a very good way of understanding what's going inside an iteration. So we can start to build up one of these dashboards. The main message here is don't get too carried away. There's lots of things we can measure, but what you need to understand before we start trying to use these measures or this kind of dashboard is how the measures work and which ones are really essential and going to provide value. Quite a few of the measures shown on that the dashboard we just looked at are very useful in certain circumstances when you're facing certain problems, but they would not be on every dashboard, and they wouldn't be useful for every project in all circumstances. So what I'd like to do is take a look at some of the measures we found most useful and talk about how they work across iterations, and also talk about Burndown charts. So let's take a look then at measuring across iterations. So how do we interpret this idea? So when we're looking across iterations, we want better quality and stability. We want to make sure that the things that we're building are the right things and they're helping us progress our project. There's plenty of measures in that space. I've listed some there. The two that aren't in italics, escape defects and risk exposure, are the two that we've found over the years to be the most useful for iterative projects. And when we look at faster progress and faster velocity, the two that we found most useful in that area are absolute progress and velocity. So we're going to take a look at those. The cheaper, it's important that you keep an eye on cost and effort. And the one we're going to look at here is effort profile. Now this is because for iterative projects, the main thing that we can control is our use of people and resources. We should always have a cost profile, but that tends to be tied into the organizational reporting cycle more than it is to the iterative cycle. There's also lots of other things in the cost profile like license costs, capital costs, one-off, hardware, etc. The effort profile is something we can use to steer the project on a iteration by iteration basis. The idea of the happier stakeholders and team members is very important. I haven't got time to delve into all those. We'll have a little discussion of those when we've looked at the other measures. The thing to remember when we're looking across iterations is we're looking for trends and things that are going to provide lagging and leading indicators of success. We mainly want to be able to get an early idea of whether the team is set up for success or failure. So let's take a look at the first one I'd like to take a look at is risk exposure. Now, risk exposure on projects is a very powerful measurement. This is if there's a lot of risk, the project is going to be more difficult, more likely to have cost overruns, more likely to have defects, more likely to run into trouble. Risk exposure is a fairly simple thing to calculate. You can look at lots of risk management books, things like that. The way I like to do it is to have the exposure be the product of the probability of the risk occurring and the magnitude of the impact if it does. And for each of those two parameters we would have settings from 1 to 5 for the impact and 0 to 5 for the probability, because you can reduce the probability to 0 in some cases. So the risk exposure would just be the product of those, giving us a top risk exposure of 25. The classic risk profile for an iterative project is in the early iterations we practice very aggressive risk mitigation. So we identify our biggest risks and we do something about them, and within a few iterations we can bring the risk exposure under control, and that's the point where you can do things like verify your commitments and expect to produce production quality code every iteration, etc. The second graph here has just come up. This is showing risk exposure for a lower risk project. The curve will be far less marked, but we can still see that we're still trying to reduce the risk every iteration, and when the project is over, then we should have no risk. So our target for risk exposure is built in, and it's that we reduce the risk to zero. When the project is finished and success, there should be no risk left to that success. So those are some good trends. What about this one? This one on the right here. Here we've got a project that is for 75% of its time doing nothing about its risks. It's just allowing that risk exposure to sit there threatening the health and success of the project. I would be much more worried working on that final project than I would on either of the first two. So reducing risk is very important. It's when we start to really understand what's going on in our project, be able to make correct and appropriate decisions. So if we just take a little look at the mechanics of the risk exposure. So we said risk exposure, the product of the probability of the risk occurring and the impact of the risk if it does occur. Here we've got a graph showing risk exposure. It's a Burndown chart. It starts with our high risk. Now you'll notice here we talk about the top 10. One of the problems that you often find with risk management is, one, you don't know all the risks at the beginning of the project, and if you do spend all your time trying to track down all the risks, you might spend weeks finding that there's 200 of them, but you haven't done anything about them. What you want to focus on is the top 10. So find your top risks, do something about them. This allows you to get started very quickly. The other problem as you go through is you start with 10, but each iteration you're going to uncover more risks or add more things to the risk list. And when the risk list gets really long, you'll find that most of those risks, you've reduced the impact, you've reduced the probability, but they haven't gone away. So having lots of those little risks counted all the time, particularly the ones that weren't on your list at the beginning, can distort the numbers and make the graph look like possibly even going the wrong way. If you just focus on the top 10, then you will get the nice curves, you'll get the drop down, because we're looking at our risk exposure. We might have lots of very small risks, but none of them, not even the fact there's lots of them, is registering as a high risk. And this gives you the classic shapes and just makes it a lot easier to get started and a lot easier to look at the graphs and compare projects, because you're not distorted by these these huge numbers. What happens if you've got more than 10 at the top level? Then you might find that for the beginning of the project you're maxing out at 250. But that's okay, because what's interesting is when it starts to come down, that's when you've got the risk under control, and that's when you start feeling more confident. On all these graphs you'll see a little red arrow, which is shows us the current iterations. We've just got to the end of iteration 6 on this particular project. So our next one we'd like to take a look at in more detail is escape defects. This is a measure of the quality of the code that's being produced. One of the things with iterative projects, and most of these measures, is they do rely on us testing stuff every iteration as we go along. So we would expect, this is a typical sort of defect trend for a sort of healthy project. We're finding the big high priority defects early in the project, and then we're reducing the numbers at the end. The grey bar across the bottom, that represents our target. We are, in this case, allowed to release the software with 30 of these defect points. If we're going to have production quality every iteration, then we should be within that tolerance every iteration, because with more than that, it's not clear cut that the software will be released. I would encourage people to have a zero tolerance for defects. This idea of defect points is to give a weighting to defects. So a priority 1 scores more points than a 2, than a 3, than a 4, than a 5. And again, this allows you those showstoppers to appear and push you above your tolerance. So that's a sort of healthy project, but one that was that had some quality problems at the beginning, possibly because they were uncovering those fundamental flaws in some of the frameworks or third-party products. That's typical of a project that's got high risk. A better defect trend would be one where we're staying either within or closer to the tolerance so that we maintain production quality. There are obviously bad defect trends. So this is one here. That's, I hope to everyone, that's obviously bad. At the end of each iteration, we've got more escape defects than we had before, and it's not coming down. The scale has had to be changed on that graph. It goes way above the others. Now, this is something that happens on a lot of iterative projects, because one of the things that iterative projects find they do is they get overly aggressive. So they don't leave enough time to do all the work in the iteration. So what do they drop? Testing. Well, they don't finish stuff, or they don't fix it, so they put in the rubbish and it exposes lots of defects. If they're not testing, well, actually, I've got a little ahead of myself, you might see a graph like this, where for many iterations there's been no testing until the 6th iteration there, where lots and lots of defects have been found and they were not able to be fixed within the iteration. Now, some of you, that may look a bit like the pattern you see on a waterfall project, but it's also the pattern you see on those bad iterative projects where they have just they haven't been able to do testing or complete any testing during the iterations. So these trends give us an idea of what's going on and what the patterns are. You may have no defects coming out, but that would have and we'll talk about the relation of defects to progress when we look at the progress graph. So just to summarize with the escape defects measure, what we're looking at is those defects that were not fixed within the iteration that they found. That's why we call them escape defects. We don't want to punish people for taking a test-first approach and being rigorous in recording the defects they found when they ran those initial tests. It's only a problem if the defects are still in the build at the end of the iteration, which typically we'd like to be production quality, i.e. free of defects. So we've got the weighting, we have our target, our tolerance, and you can see here that we achieve production quality in this case by the 4th iteration. If we can stay within that tolerance the whole time, then that's to be obviously encouraged. But we can see this and compare and contrast against other projects. Okay, so what about the progress? Now, I like to do a burn-up chart for progress. I'm not very fond of burn-down charts for measuring, say, release burn-down, because of scope changes. In fact, they tend to end up going negative. What's your target? Here we've got a clear target. You can see the black line shown with the grey area. That's our target at the beginning of the project. And then each iteration we are scoring some story points. Now those story points could be related to user stories or use cases or even features. You can even use story points with declarative requirements. It just gives us a relative effort here, so we're measuring our story points. And you can see in this case we've got the classic S-curve. This is what you'd expect for a high-risk project. To score the story points, the piece of functionality, the requirements must be implemented and tested. So if there are defects, we won't score that in terms of progress. So this S-curve goes with that kind of, the defect blip at the beginning. It's finding those underlying defects that in the most risky areas of our applications, one of the reasons that leads to this kind of S-curve. If we have lower risk and a more mature development environment, we may get the straight line. We see this in a lot of mature projects and a lot of small enhancements and things like that. It's useful for you to track progress and compare against these two curves. If I had an S-curve, will I make my target? If I had a straight line, will I make my target? Because you need to be able to recognize the bad ones. So here, this progress here after is very similar. It's the same as our S-curve, but it never picked up speed. So here, we could extrapolate from the first two. If it's a straight line, we're in trouble. If it's an S-curve, it needs to pick up. So we can look at this and see this, and this will allow us to make decisions. There's lots of decisions we could do if we understood our risk profile, our escape defects, and our progress. We could trade off things like scope against risk, reducing the scope and bringing in, see if we can produce something of value with a lot less of the story points. The final progress graph we've got here is this one. This would be, well, again, this is when they're not doing any testing until the end, because until it's tested and verified, then we can't score any of our story points as done. So always looking for things that are done. If we had our progress chart, like one of the top two, and no defects, remember the escape defects, one along the bottom, that would be fabulous because all of the software is defect free. Okay, with this one where we've got no progress, we may have lots of defects or we may have no defects depending on whether we've been doing any testing or not. This is why we need to have a number of these measures in conjunction with each other to really see how we're getting on. So the last little bit on the progress chart is that this is a burn up. Like I say, if this was a burn down chart, we would set our initial target. So here we had 530 or something story points was our, what we said we'd do at the beginning of the project. And if we had a burn down, our target would be to hit 0. And then if our scope increased, as the grey line shows some scope increase there across the middle iteration, some more requirements were added on in iteration number 2, upping the number of story points. That would lead us the burn down to start having a target underneath. Okay, and I find that personally a little disturbing, going negative. But also, just the burn ups to me has more feeling of achievement. But it's up to you which way up you have the graphs. You can see here that if we had our S-curve and we were tracking after iteration number 4, we would maybe have thought, actually, if we keep going at this speed, we're going to be able to make the full scope. But then it becomes apparent that this isn't going to happen, so we can look at the descoping. So we can track the original scope, which is what we committed, our current scope, which will often be prone to scope creep. This is very important to look at both those lines and areas on the graph, because a lot of iterative projects get a reputation for descoping, which is untrue. What has actually happened is they've refocused to deliver more, as much or more than they promised. It's just not necessarily the initial set of requirements. This is part of our ability to embrace change on our iterative project. You could also set some bands for tolerances if you had a sort of a 70%, 30% kind of target setting. Okay, so that's the progress one. Okay, so another very common and useful measure that we see on a lot of agile initiative projects is velocity. Now velocity is actually just the tangent of the progress graph, but we can do some interesting things if we understand velocity. If we're going to have a project and we give it 7 iterations, as the case here, the grey banding there shows that's the average velocity that would be required if this was to achieve this project. And you can see here we had a low velocity for the first 2 iterations and then it went up. This is the pattern of velocity where we have an S-curve. This is something we need to be aware about. There are many reasons why our velocity in terms of implemented story points may happen at the end. It depends what we have to do in those hardening iterations. It depends how much training, support, what kind of pilots or beta testing and things are going on during that period of time. Okay, so that would be the velocity pattern for an S-curve project. Here again, this is the velocity for a team with the straight line progress. And here we've got the velocity being exactly what we expected each time. And that's pretty unlikely. It's likely to go above and below the expected line as we go through the project. But these guys are really highly performing here. The third graph here, this isn't doing so well. Across the iterations, we're never achieving the average velocity. If we don't achieve the average or exceed the average velocity, again, we're going to struggle to bring in our progress and we'd have to take some action. The velocity, like progress, relies on us having completed things. It's done again in story points. So here would be the kind of, the velocity chart for one of those projects where there's no testing until the end. Don't allow people to claim story points for stories that have not been verified by testing and not been, gone through some initial acceptance. Obviously, if we get defects in things that we've already counted, we'd have to take them off. So if you broke things badly enough, you could even achieve a negative velocity within a project, within an iteration. When we're tracking velocity, we like to show, compare against the average velocity, show the velocity. You need to think about the progress at the same time here. But we like to add a purple line. Now that shows how the velocity we need over the remaining iterations, what velocity we'd need over the remaining iterations. Because of our slow progress in the first 2 iterations, you can see that our average actually went up, but because of those 3 highly productive iterations in the middle, the velocity has started to come down. And we're far exceeding the velocity we need at the end. So in that 7th iteration, we may well exceed the published scope. Okay, so we've looked at a number now. The final one I'd like to look at in some detail is the effort profile. Now, a lot of agile software and iterative projects, they're quite small teams. They often own an application, they get a budget for a year, and they're going to spend that budget, which is directly proportional to effort. So they tend to be doing the cost reporting separately, but the thing we can control most within the project is how much effort we're going to do. And we need to keep looking at this on an iteration by iteration basis. We may have fixed size teams, or we may have variable size teams. Certainly people who are doing larger scale iterative projects may have a tiger team in place to get the risks under control and then scale up into a more production environment, well, as we once the risks are under control. So that would be the classic kind of unified process effort profile there. The grey shows what we estimated beforehand. So when we do release plans, we do need to do some estimating for things like what resources are we going to need over this series of iterations. The blue line shows the effort that we've done, and you can see they're perfectly coinciding in that case. For a fixed size team that's dedicated to the project full-time all the time, you would expect to get the same amount of effort every iteration. Think of those extreme programming teams where it's 40 hours a week, every week. So you can take the 40 hours a week, times it by the number of weeks in the iteration, times it by the number of people. That would be your estimate, and then you can check. Now there's lots of reasons why the actual effort may fall short of the original one. So here we have a team where we're not getting as much effort as we had originally planned. This probably means we won't make as much progress or get as high a velocity, although it might be that the small amount of effort is actually achieving our goals. This is why, again, we need to look at a number of measures in balance. What's happened there on the 3rd iteration is they forgot that the World Cup was happening. I hope you've all been enjoying the World Cup. I didn't enjoy Sunday much as someone from the UK, but overall it's good. But if you work I'm in Holland at the moment, so yesterday there was a big Holland game. Nobody worked yesterday afternoon. Nobody will be working Friday afternoon. Or it could be a Christmas holiday or something like that. And often those things get neglected. So we expected half, but actually no one turned up in that iteration at all. No effort happened. That could be because of holidays. Often the team has other things they're supposed to do, lots of unplanned support work. There might be a major disaster on the operational system and all the resources off the next release are taken into support. So you have to keep an eye on those things and understand, one, how that affects your planning, and two, what impact that has on your velocity, your progress, and your quality levels. When we're looking at effort, what we actually like to do is we have the initial estimate that we did when we set the project up, and then each iteration we like to do an estimate. How much time are we actually going to have, guys? And that's what the little green lines are showing. So when we went to the first iteration, we expected to get 80 man days, and we fell a bit short. We looked at it, so the second iteration we estimated is slightly below 80, and we hit that one on the nail. When we got to the third iteration, which is where the holiday should have been, we actually managed to get a little bit more effort than we expected. So we started to be a bit conservative in 3 and 4, and then 5 and 6 came in on the button again, right on the nail. You can see now, although there's no actuals for iteration number 7, because we've finished iteration 6, we've estimated how much effort we're going to do. Okay, and again, when we look at our progress, our objectives, our velocity, we can look at what we need to have in place for the next iterative time box. So that can be very powerful. Okay, so that's a number of the measures across the things. We tended to look at those because of their relationship. The graphs complement each other. Scope affects risk exposure. If I get rid of certain risky requirements, I might be able to bring my risk profile down. Okay. Escape defects affect progress. Effort affects progress and velocity. Scope affects costs, etc. This is why you need to think about and have some balance on your dashboard. There's other things that might affect the effort you get. In fact, if no one's enjoying the project, if the happiness scores are low, again, that might be because people don't they're not turning up for this project. They're just not happy with this one. So that was some ideas for measuring across iterations. Like I said, we've got other measures. You can see them on the illustrated dashboard. What goes on inside iterations? Okay, so the main weapon we have in our armory for measuring inside iterations that a lot of people use is Burndown charts. Now there's lots of low-level measures for things like test coverage and all sorts of things that you could measure inside an iteration, but the Burndown is certainly one that's very popular, and I'm sure a lot of you have seen, heavily popularized by Scrum and Sprint. So here we have a Burndown chart. Now, one of the interesting things about a Burndown chart is knowing what your target is. Typically, a Burndown chart is done on work, so the target at the end of the iteration is there's no time left, so we can't possibly have any more work to do this iteration. So our target is to get to 0. But you have to be careful because a colleague of mine has just been adopting lean software development to try and make himself more lean. So he had a Burndown chart for his weight. So you've got to know what your target is because you're in trouble if that one gets down to 0, I suspect. Okay, so you need to have, whenever you use one of these measures, you need to understand what the target is. And for Burndown charts, it's typically 0. But here we have 2 Burndown charts, one on the left, one on the right. Which of those projects, which of those teams is being the most successful? Have a think about that for a few seconds. Because when we burn down, what we're showing is the work that we currently have left to do inside the iteration or inside the sprint. This is why they end at 0. The team on the left have, the orange bar shows added or removed work. The team on the left has been doing all the work. The team on the right has just been de-scoping whenever life gets a bit hard. So at the end of the iteration, although the burn down shows no work remaining in this iteration, it's because they've actually de-scoped everything. So work can come in or be taken off the list during the iteration. It's actually useful to complement the burn down chart work with a burn up of results. This is what a lot of people do. So here we have again those same 2. The green area shows the burn up of the work completed. The yellow area above that shows the work that's in progress, and the grey area shows pending. So on the left-hand chart, you can see that by the end of the iteration, everything that was on the list to be done has been done. There's nothing, no work in progress, no outstanding work. That's a fabulous performance by the team. The one on the right, you can see that we've got the same burn down, but look, we started loads of things, and then when we couldn't do them, we just de-scoped them. So at the end of the iteration, there's no work left, but we haven't actually completed anything in that case. So you have to make sure you understand the target and understand how to interpret things like burn down charts. The burn down chart that I personally like to use would be a work burn down. So when we do our iteration or our sprint planning, we identify the tasks that we're going to do in the iteration, and we set them up at the beginning. So this is for typical Scrum. So we may get some work coming in. Although we try and protect the team, there may be additional work that needs to be taken on board. The pending line shows that, how much work in total there is to be done at the top. Okay, we can see how much is in progress, we can see how much has been completed, and how much is left to do. So here we've got to the end of day 18, okay, and we've got, you can see that we have completed just over 60 of our 100 days of task. We have half of, most of what's remaining in progress. The scope is the amount of work we've got rid of the stuff we didn't think we could do by the end of the iteration, so it looks like we'd have a nice flight path. This is done on tasks. Sometimes we like to do it on objectives if we do more rolling planning. Some people like to do their burn down in the iteration on story points, and this is an example of someone else's burn down chart. You can see the reference down the bottom there. The blue line, burn line, the remaining estimated story point backlog for the iteration. Okay, we have the total story point script, so that's gone up and come down, so presumably some story points that were added and then removed, it's gone up a bit again. And we have the burn up for the completed story points. So we can watch that one converging on the number of story points. I like to show explicitly where things have been added and removed. I find that personally very useful. There's lots of other things you can measure inside an iteration, things like test coverage and those things, but they're not really trending. They're just sort of, all right, we've done lots of testing now, this is what's going on. Okay, so we've seen quite a few measures now. So what should we actually measure? What would be a good place to start? Okay, so we would recommend 4 simple measures that would allow you to understand the health of your project. This is something I personally would recommend every iterative project doing. They allow you to understand where you are relative to where you need to be. It allows you to understand when the project's in trouble and what areas you should be focusing attention on. They're very simple. You can capture these measures very easily. To do the progress, you just need story points related to your use cases or user stories. The risk exposure we talked about earlier, just the product of probability and impact. Escape defects, just prioritize them and give them a weighting. Effort expended, just do the estimate each iteration and the time recording. So this gives you a good indication of the health of your project. If you see that you've got your defect trends are going wrong, if your risks aren't coming down or your progress is not sufficient, or people just aren't turning up, so you're always getting less effort and work than you should have done, then you can start to take action. That may lead you to thinking about other measures. I worked on a project where it was a very nice iterative project, nice and agile. It did a very good job of setting it all up. But every iteration we had about half the progress that we'd wanted, and the risks were not coming down as quickly. Didn't have many escape defects. What we did have was only about half the effort every iteration. And that's because the people were part-time on the project and they didn't turn up as much as they should because it wasn't to them as high a priority. And to do that, we then needed to sort of, think about and replan our project. We could either get more of their time, or we could, halve the scope, or we could extend. So we could take action based on those leading indicators of success and failure. So, given what we see from the health of our project, right. I missed me click there. Okay. So those 4 measures can be put together with a Burndown chart to form a nice dashboard. Could you advance the slide for me, Leanne? I seem to not be able to.
Whoops.
Don't know which one.
I think we've gone too far.
So I'd quite like the add a Burndown chart to create a simple dashboard. I'm still seeing 4 simple measures of project health, I'm afraid.
Right. Right.
Cool.
Yeah,
Can you go back 2 more? If you just type in 38, it'll probably go to the one I want.
Yeah, okay. I apologize. I don't know what's happened. Technical glitch. Okay, there we go. You should see it.
That was the one.
Okay.
Okay. So will you advance the slides for me then? Leah?
So I can do that.
Okay. So if we take those 4 key measures out of Burndown chart, we get quite a nice simple dashboard that projects can use. Just go to the next slide. Okay. And then, based on any issues or problems, you can add more measures as needed. So if you have defect problems, you might want to look at your numbers for priority 1 or 2. If you're finding you're not making enough progress, it might be because people are doing unplanned instead of planned work, not working on the things they should be. So those would be some things in better. You may find that you want to look more at your spends or have a burn down estimate to complete in the cheaper area there. Something I like to do for the faster is just have a little traffic light that tells me if the average velocity, if I maintain the average velocity over the last 3 iterations, am I going to hit my target? And that's something we can interpret automatically, and that allows us to have that velocity check and things like that. The bottom area, the happier, is quite an interesting one. If I'm introducing agile and iterative to projects, I like to measure whether the stakeholders are happy with this and whether the team are happy with this. It's very easy to come up with some tools and questions you can use in the retrospectives and at the demonstrations to find out how happy people are. A very simple way of getting a team satisfaction measure is every retrospective allow them to, something we do is just, you can have a number of different smiley faces from a very sad one to a happy one. They just register their happiness. The 2 patterns that you see in those graphs in the bottom right hand corner, often the stakeholders are resistant and don't like the idea. They're scared of all this agile and this iterative stuff. So they might start quite low, but you should see as the iterations are effective that starts to rise. The team satisfaction shows the kind of dip in attitude you can get sometimes as they actually find out this is quite hard and requires them to measure things and test things and do things. So they might get a little dip in their happiness, but they should again come out. So those can be interesting things to track. My experience is they tend to look at those when things are new. Once everyone's got used to iterating and have got good relationships, then they might find those questions and some of those tools just to be a little bit of overhead. So it's a good idea to have an indicator whether you're getting enough stakeholder involvement. Often the stakeholders won't engage, which makes our iterations far less effective. And I like to have a formal assessment on the iterations where we have a pass at risk, fail kind of system, so we can just have an iteration check on how we're doing. If you could just move to the next slide, Leah. So where would I start? Well, I'd take those 4 measures of health. I would add some traffic lights for the stakeholder involvement. Again, if I was introducing, I might look at the happiness things as well. I like to collect the smileys at the retrospectives, whether we make that formally a measure or not. relies on the psychology of the team and people. I would have the iteration check, traffic light, the velocity check to show whether the average over velocity is going to bring us in. And I'd have a budget check just to make sure that we're coming in within budget over the months. Combine that with a Burndown chart, and we have quite a nice dashboard that we can use on our iterative projects that will lead us to understand if there's anything else we need to measure. We can dip down into some of those other areas. Each of these measures are very easy to collect. Usually the information is available to you, or you can track progress in your requirements management tool. Risk exposure easily done in a spreadsheet. Defects from your testing or your incident management tool. Effort from your timesheets. So fairly easy to set up. All we're doing really is adding one or two numbers at the end of every iteration, and we should be looking at those anyway. Okay, well that's the end of the spiel. Sorry it took a little longer than planned, but hopefully we got a bit of time for some questions. So it's back to Leanne now.
Thank you very much, Ian. I apologize for the technical issue. Before questions, well, first I want to remind everyone that you can submit questions to Ian. So submit those in the question function in your panel, and we will pass those. I'll pass those on to Ian. We are going to be taking a break from our webcast series for the summer, a little summer holiday from the webcast, but we will be starting up again in September. So watch for the next one. It will probably be late summer. We'll start to promote the next webcast series. And the other thing to mention today is that the recording will be available tomorrow, probably by afternoon at the latest your time. So I do have a question, Ian. And the first question is, please clarify, referring to the last progress chart shown, it appeared scope was increased, but at the, my question disappeared on me, but at the end of the 7th, I believe is what it said. For some reason, we're having some technical issues. My question even disappeared on me. So, so it was, please refer, if you can clarify the last slide. So I'll go back to the last slide, Ian, and
I think you actually want number 22.
There was at the end, but at the end of the 7th. Please clarify, referring to the last progress chart shown. There we go. It appears scope was increased. So
yeah, so you actually need slide 22, Leanne.
22. Okay.
So if you just type 22, if you just type 22, it should go to it.
No, for some reason it's not. Okay. We'll do it the long way. I apologize.
So on the do we have another question while we navigate to that?
I apologize. I'm at the slide, actually, yes.
Right. So I believe the question is applying to this slide. One of the things that some of the issues we have with doing all these graphs are real graphs drawn in Excel. So the red line shows us the last iteration we've done. If we don't do any work, we will end up with the same progress we had previously. So you've got a choice whether you want to try hiding the lines or not. You can see that between iteration, the first two iterations, we had an increase in scope, and then in the 5th iteration, we reduced the scope back to our original target. So when you're tracking progress, you've got to realize that the target may move on you. And this is one of the reasons I prefer a burn up to a burn down. Where you see a red line on here, basically then to the right of that is the future. And well, some of the graphs they show, that is where you would be if you do no work. Okay, so just a little quirk of Excel there, really. So I hope that answers the question. So the grey area shows the current scope, the black line, the original scope, and yes, we did increase and decrease scope at the beginning and then decrease in iteration number 5.
Yeah.
Very hard to draw vertical lines in Excel.
Okay, another question was on another...
Do you have any more questions?
Yes, so another question is on another chart. If you can comment further on the Burndown chart, the multicolor one. So I'm not sure which, I don't know if you remember which slide number that was.
It would be, it's on quite a few of them, but it would be on, the big one would be on slide number, got me things in the wrong order here. It'll be on slide number 34.
Okay. There we go. You should be seeing it.
Can't see it yet.
Oh, I am on the slide.
One before that one.
The one before? Oh, sorry. I managed to move, I guess. Oops. Do you see it now? Knowing what's in progress and what's done?
That one will do, but I think the actual slide would be. All my bits of paper have got me muddled up now, I'm afraid. So I think it would be one after that.
Okay, so it must have been this one here.
That one there. Okay, I think this is the chart that the question is referring to. So the black line is the classic burn down, and the red is the expected burn down across. That's the classic burn down chart. The orange bars show when work is added or removed. So you can see that on the 7th day, the 13th day and the 16th day, some more work, be it additional story points or additional tasks to do, have been added. And that has led our top line, which shows how much in total we're expected to do, to go up. And it peaked on day 16. Right, on day 17, we removed some elements because it became apparent, probably during our daily stand-up, that we were not going to get all of that done in the remaining time. Some new things, possibly more important, have been added, so let's remove the least important ones. The other thing that we're showing on here is, so the top grey, that shows the total amount that we're supposed to be doing. The green, growing green area, shows how much we have done, how much has been completed. The yellow shows what's in progress, and the red line shows that we are currently on day 18. So I've messed my graph up because I've taken some work out on 19, and we haven't got there yet, which I can only apologise. But you can see where we are. You can see that we have about 30 days of work left to do, and given our projected performance, that should be okay. That should come in no problem. We've finished a lot of the stuff, about 60, and we've got enough to do. So what the graph is showing is a burn up in terms of completed and in progress work, the total target, which varies as work's added or removed, and the classic burn down over the top. The thing about burn down charts, and the reason I'm sometimes not much of a fan of them, is you need to have that context, as we saw before. Otherwise, you can't tell if there's really been any progress. Okay, so we see a big drop between day 16 and 17. Okay, purely because we de-scoped. We didn't actually finish anything between 16 and 17. See, the green's a straight line. We did start a load of stuff. We didn't finish anything. And again, we didn't finish anything on day 18 either. Is that okay? Hopefully that answers the question. Do you have any more, Leanne?
Thank you. It's a question, I believe, back to the previous slide that we were on before, is how do you get scope to return to the original number, and where do you show the decrease in scope? If that, you can answer that if there's enough context.
So we show the scope on the progress graph. That's the grey area. So you could see it go up. Now, how did we get it to come down? Well, we would have had to have some agreement with our stakeholders. Okay, so one of the things that we're going to do every iteration as part of our assessment is we're going to look at the graphs, look at the trends. At the beginning of that, within that iteration assessment, we said, okay, this is our velocity, we're doing well, we're going to hit our original target, but it doesn't look like we'll have enough bandwidth to do those additional requirements that were added. What do you want to do? Do you want to give us an extra iteration, or should we adjust the scope? So the graphs give you a basis for discussions about what you should do. You need to take action on those. In that graph, we probably left it a bit long before we did the descoping, but the idea is that you've seen the scope increase, you've seen our original target, we're looking at the progress. In this case, we firmly believe it's going to be an S-curve, so we've extrapolated, and we're not going to make it all the way up to 650 story points. Okay, so how do you do the descoping? Well, they were in scope at the beginning of iteration 5, out of scope by the end of iteration 6. We don't have the granularity to say exactly which day the decision was made, but by the end of the iteration, they were no longer in scope, so we didn't need to worry about them in the iteration 7. We would have needed more iterations if we wanted to do that extra work. Okay, so I hope that answers that question.
Thank you.
Anything else?
No, that's it at this point, and we are past our time, so we'll wrap up. But I do want to mention, if anybody has any questions, please feel free to send an email. Ian is providing his email address here, so if you do have a question on a particular topic on this presentation, please feel free to ask Ian. If you have questions regarding services in your region, training, mentoring, etc., consulting, please contact me and I'll put you in touch with the correct person in country. And of course, we have a lot of various resources on our website in the resources area. So thank you everybody for joining us today, and thank you, Ian. Goodbye.
Bye everyone.